Thank you for the lovely introduction, but the truth is I really do have nothing left to say. So we'll see if I can just say the same things the other folks said in a couple different ways. I think to start, so actually there's some points that I'll disagree with a little bit. So to start, I am a real fiscal conservative. For me, that does mean more of a focus on concerns about deficits and debt. And I would acknowledge and agree with the problem that if you look at where we're headed, the problem is unquestionably a spending problem. In our budget, we have both spending and revenues projected to go well above historical averages, as spending by much more. That's a spending problem. What I have yet to see is anybody who's been able to specifically solve that entire problem on the spending side of the budget. So I am open to it. I would like to see it. I encourage everybody to get more specific on that. But I wouldn't stop at saying it's okay if we bring spending down and we bring taxes down more and we have big gaping deficits or debt, because I think that's still a threat to the economy in a major way. And I would actually say to those folks who are most concerned about controlling spending, one of the best ways to do it is make people pay for everything that we're spending at the government level. If you allow yourself to borrow when you're increasing government spending, it feels free. And so who doesn't want to do it? That's why for the past years we've had politicians who've told us that we can have it all. And it feels pretty painless because all you see is the deficit growing. But if you actually make yourself pay for what you're spending, then you have to confront the trade-offs. And I think that's actually one of the more effective ways to control spending. But on to the solutions. There are a couple points I want to make. The first one is the bulk of our budget does not have a budget. And that is sort of a preposterous starting point for budgeting. When we make a budget, I'd actually start with the point that we've worked on a commission for the past 2 years called the Peterson-Pew Commission, and we focused on reforming the budget process. And we were going through it, and we were thinking about all sorts of things like joint budget resolutions and baselines, which are a critically important area to reform. But in the middle of it, we just came to the point that when we put out budgets in this country, we have no fiscal goal. It's kind of remarkable that if you're flying blind, you have no place you're trying to go, of course you're going to kind of end up in the wrong place, which is where our budget unquestionably is right now. So one of the things I think is really critical is that you start with a fiscal goal, whether that's balancing the budget. We've recommended that over the decade we need to stabilize the debt at something that's on its way back to historical levels of below 40%. We probably can't get there within a decade, but certainly on a glide path that getting to 60% moderately quickly and back down to historical levels as quickly as possible. But part of the other thing that's missing from the budget process is the lack of budgeting for mandatory pieces of the budget. And so I think one of the great starting points to think about is how do you actually put mandatory or entitlement spending on a budget? And it shouldn't be sort of that shocking idea. In discretionary spending, we've had spending caps. Recently they haven't been statutory. I think we'll head back in that direction. But you want to think about how to put Social Security, Medicare, and the other mandatory programs on a budget as well. That allows for the necessary debate of the trade-offs. As mandatory is squeezing out all other parts of the budget, is that what you want to have? And couldn't you instead budget for it, plan in advance, and not let it sort of rule our destiny? The second point that I talk about with mandatory programs is that the changes do need to be structural, and that's a lot of what we've heard from the other folks here. I suppose the one place I would disagree is on private accounts with Social Security, which is how I first got into this whole fiscal world from having a real normal job in a real business. And I became just a huge proponent of private accounts for Social Security. And the best thing was that this was, I guess, 10 years ago, when the program was running large surpluses. And not only was it a better way to restructure the program, but it made sense because it was probably the only way to ensure that these surpluses were saved, because government trust funds doesn't do it. The money doesn't get spent, as Steve was saying before. It gets spent on other government programs. I mean, sorry, it does get spent. It doesn't get saved so that it's waiting for you when you're there. So I spent years, including writing my master's thesis on how to transition to a system of private accounts. I think one of the huge sort of casualties of the delay that we've seen in the budget recently is that I think we've waited too long to transition to the system of large carve-out accounts that I supported a while ago, because doing so, and Dan would disagree, but the transitional cost right now would add trillions of dollars to the budget deficits at a time when we've lost all fiscal flexibility. And so to me, it's one of the lessons of why you don't want to delay on reforming entitlements. You want to do it while you have the opportunity so you can actually think that important exercise of, if you were starting Social Security today, what would it look like? Well, obviously, it would have a large component of people saving for their own retirement and some element of an insurance component probably mixed in with that. Unfortunately, I think we're probably looking now at more a system of add-on accounts than carve-out accounts. and anything else would probably bust the budget in the process. On Medicare and Medicaid, completely agree with the point that we've heard before. And on Medicare, I think the encouraging news that I would put out there is I do think that a system of vouchers or premium support is something that's going to gain momentum over the coming decade. We just went through this very painful healthcare reform exercise. Everybody feels kind of bruised. Nobody really wants to talk about incremental reforms. We're going to have the fight about whether to repeal or not, but that's not going to be the solution. We're still going to have to reform the system no matter what happens. And I think we're going to move into increasing price sensitivity, making sure that people are more connected to the prices of their own health care. I think vouchers, it's not a magic answer, right? What you do is you put in a voucher and you cap the growth of it. It doesn't mean that suddenly you get all the health care you want. We still have to come to the basic acceptance that either you pay for more health care or you get less health care, and that's the discussion we should be having. But by putting a system of vouchers in, you add a lot of market disciplines that help us make those choices and help make them more transparent. And they add stuff on the demand side, which we haven't really seen in healthcare reform so far. One point where I'd also, I think, go farther than Dan would or disagree slightly is I'm kind of tired of all the political promises on entitlement reform, not to touch any current retirees, not to make changes soon. I think we have to stop delaying. We have known about these problems forever. I mean, the Social Security trustees warn every single year that the program needs changes, and then you hear, oh, it's fine, it's not part of the deficit. Of course we have to make changes. Of course we have to make changes to Medicare. We need to make them as quickly as possible. And so those of us on the outside who have no political future whatsoever at least can try to push the political class not to make all these promises about not touching current seniors. And by the way, my father likes to come and protest at any discussion I ever have because he loves his Social Security, so I'm sure he's out there with a placard. But you know, we've gone from don't touch anybody who's currently on the program to don't touch anybody who's younger than 55. Remember there was one point when I think Vice President Gore said don't touch anybody who's alive today or something. You know, sooner or later it's going to be nobody in the century. So these promises of all the people we're going to protect make it much, much harder to change these programs. I think the focus right now, both by House Republicans and by the White House, we're going to see in their budget on Monday, on domestic discretionary cuts, completely misses the point. I think it's great to be starting to talk about how to control spending and seeing real cuts, but the focus of today's discussion, mandatory spending, is where the problem is. Nobody is talking about that. And I think that's a political calculation, and I think it's a really unfortunate one because it continues the whole notion of we can kind of pretend the big elephant in the room, entitlement reforms, isn't there, and we have to just put it out on the table and start having an honest, straightforward discussion of how to reform these programs. So I think we pretty much agreed on how most of us, we would reform most of them. There are other approaches, that's great, let's put them on the table, but let's not delay and focus on this small 12% slice of the budget. So finally, well, two more points. One, I would say there are also entitlements we haven't touched on much, but need to be not just sort of reformed, but ended. You know, agriculture subsidies for those of us in the budget world, it's just kind of insane that we're still budgeting for a whole different era. Things like TRICARE, which are actually more part of the security budget, but the health and pension systems that go for defense are going to bust the budget. That's not good security policy right there. So I think you also want to put some of the smaller mandatory programs on the table and think about whether they belong there, just like we need to do in domestic discretionary, see whether there's still an actual reason to have those programs. So finally, I think I'm the most courageous person here today because I am a political independent who has come to CPAC, and I feel like that I must be I always feel odd, yeah, thank you. I always feel kind of alone and orphaned in Washington as it is, but certainly I do here. But I'm going to make the case I always make, which is to both parties, why we shouldn't be delaying on entitlement reform. So what I say to liberals, and I believe this completely, Dan, are you saying something more?
I haven't voted Republican since Reagan. So,
okay, all right. But you know, I think for those progressives who are most worried about keeping the safety net, the worst thing they can do is continue to delay on entitlement reform. Because we have an opportunity right now, and the Fiscal Commission put out a lot of good recommendations to reform these programs in a way that actually protects the benefits of people who depend on them. If we continue to wait, that's not going to happen. The safety net's going to be shredded. That doesn't make any sense to me for anybody who professes to care about the people who depend on Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. Likewise, on the other side, I think, you know, there's been a big discussion about VATs and whether we should, I'm a big believer that we should have consumption taxes, but that we should replace the income tax and the payroll tax in part with consumption taxes. But there's been discussions about an add-on VAT. Should we just put a VAT in there and right, you're shaking your head. And that's been where the political discussion has been so far. If you put a VAT in place, my biggest concern about it certainly is it just takes all the pressure off of spending cuts. And so you just don't see any of the reforms we're talking about. We just ramp up the amount of spending. But if we delay on entitlement reform, and if we delay and you have politicians who are still saying, well, I can't touch anybody who's older than 3, you can be assured that what we'll end up with is a VAT. The way that conservatives who most care about controlling spending need to get involved with this is to change entitlements quickly, because if we delay, we will end up having such a big fiscal gap that we will end up dropping in a VAT, and I think that that's the worst thing you can do if your main motivation is to control spending. So I guess I managed to say most of the things you all said over and over again, and I will end there. Thank you.